Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Peak Lesbian, an exclusive podcast. I'm your host, Carol. Today, I have a special guest, Elle Cooney. She has a Substack. I will have links in the show notes. We're going to have a little chat about female-only spaces. She recently wrote a Substack article called On Returning from Women's Land. And so we're going to have a chat about women's land, female spaces, and welcome, Elle.
Hi, Carol.
Thank you for coming on and talking to me about this.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So let's start out by just give us a little brief history, because I know from reading your Substack and some of your other stuff that you used to be in the very, I guess, queer woke soup, maybe, and now you're not. And so tell us just a little bit about how you came out of that and kind of what was your peaking, maybe, like what made you go, huh?
Yeah. It's kind of a long story. So I'm 28 now, and I went to undergrad 2014 to 2018. So I would say that I got in the queer soup, as you put it, probably on Tumblr when I was a teenager. I knew that I liked girls when I was like 16 or 17, and there was nobody really else out at my high school. And so I went to the internet to try to find other girls who were talking about liking girls. And on Tumblr, I learned a lot of the queer stuff, the gender stuff. And then I went to college and I started studying women's studies, which then became women gender sexuality studies, which then sort of got the idea in my head that woman doesn't really mean much of anything and anybody can identify in or out of being a woman. And I myself was really trying to figure out how I was gonna be a lesbian in the world. I was experimenting with my own like gender presentation and starting to date women. And I got the idea that I was non-binary because I didn't feel like other women. And so I identified as non-binary for a couple of years. And then I moved to Portland, Oregon. And the queer scene out there is really intense, like really kind of insane.
I've heard that.
Yeah, so I think I just started noticing some things that like weren't sitting right with me. And I also was not doing well mentally. It was putting a lot of strain on my mental health because I never really wanted to physically transition. I never had gender dysphoria, but I just had this idea in my head that I wasn't a woman, that it was hurtful and harmful when other people acknowledged me as a woman, but I looked like a woman. So it was this constant sort of just destabilizing. Yeah.
Can I ask what made you think that your feelings wasn't like woman feelings? Like what about what? Yeah,
It was very theoretical. It was very much grounded in queer theory, which I had studied a lot in undergrad. So, and I've always just felt sort of different than other girls. When you see me, like I'm relatively feminine. At the time I was exploring a little bit more like masculinity because I was starting to date women and I was at the time dating more feminine women and sort of like exploring maybe if I could take on like a more butch role in relationships. And so I liked keeping my hair short. I liked not wearing makeup. I still don't really like wearing makeup. I never wore heels. Like I'm really tall. I've always been bigger than other girls. Like it was just these things that
so stereotypes.
Exactly. When you bring them out into the light and
Yeah.
look at them from any basic feminist perspective, don't make sense. But at the time, like it was so convoluted in my head. And this idea of like, I'm different than other girls, than other women was so
So let
strong.
me ask you, what you don't know what other girls were thinking. So how do you know that you were thinking different than other girls?
I mean, this is a great question that if somebody would have asked me at the time, I actually remember talking to my mom and she said, "Well, do you not think that other women feel this way?" And I was like, "I don't know."
Yeah.
But yeah, like it was the kind of thing that once you start to talk about it out loud, stops making sense. But like I said, like I was not really mentally stable or healthy, and I wasn't thinking very clearly. I wasn't like taking care of myself in any sort of stable way. And so I wasn't, also my brain was not fully developed. Like I just was not thinking in a logical way. Like now when I look back on it, you're right, it doesn't make sense. But at the time it was like I would get offended if somebody said she and referring to me. I'd be like, why are they assuming I'm a woman when I'm, walking around the world clearly a woman?
Because they see an adult female.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So craziness. I can attribute a lot of coming out of this to meeting my butch girlfriend. And so when I met her, like she's just very comfortable in her masculinity. It's just her natural way of being. There's like pictures of her as a little girl wearing a tie, like and when I met her, I remember talking to her because she was identifying as like they them, and I just asked her like, what does that mean to you? And she said, well, I just feel like I'm not pretty, skinny, or feminine enough to be a woman.
Oh
And
my
I
God.
was like, what?
Yeah.
So at the time I was still kind of in the sauce there. And so I said, I respect your identity, but I don't think that you have to be pretty, skinny, or feminine to be a woman. And so these thoughts started like percolating in my head. And meanwhile, we're having this relationship that is making me feel more comfortable being feminine. And I'm seeing how like a, a naturally masculine woman moves through the world, not someone who's trying to put it on, but just that's just the way she is. So all that stuff started like percolating. I stopped identifying as non-binary. And then I started writing about this stuff because it was so convoluted in my head that I was like, I gotta start to get this stuff out. And so that's where my Substack started. And I would say that my final like peaking moment was I had a therapist who I had been seeing for 2 years. And I wrote this whole story on my Substack, but I'd been seeing her for 2 years. And at the time when I started seeing her, I was very deep in this. And I had told her like I wanted to talk about gender in our sessions. And when I started questioning it, I tried to like bring it up to her, and it caused a complete breakdown of the therapeutic relationship because um we ended up talking about J.K. Rowling. She wanted me to agree that J.K. Rowling was transphobic and should be held accountable. And these were just things that like I could not get behind. And because I wouldn't agree with her, she refused to continue seeing me. And I
Oh my
just,
God.
yeah, I
Wow,
just,
that's not very professional at all.
no, it was very like unethical,
Yeah.
honestly. But it was this sort of like walk through fire moment for me of like, this is like, I'm starting to really understand what I believe and what I think about gender. And as a woman and as a lesbian, I have every right to have my own opinions about what it means to be a woman and a lesbian. And even if someone tries to tell me they're bad, wrong opinions, that doesn't change the fact that this is what makes sense to me. So
Yeah.
that was sort of like, I think the final peaking moment for me where I was like, you know what, I'm going to explore these ideas. If someone, and I always say this, if someone wants to change my mind, offer me an argument that makes sense and I will be open to it. But what I'm not open to and what won't change my mind is the shaming, the you're not a good person if you don't believe this. Yeah.
It's such an appeal to empathy.
Yes, right.
It's that's
Hurting people.
the
Mhm.
whole thing goes back to that. And that's no. Let's
Yeah,
talk logic. That's how we're supposed to do it,
yeah. And as a younger woman, that worked on me because my main priority was being nice, not hurting anyone, not offending anyone. That is no longer my priority.
That's a real struggle for
Yeah.
women
Mhm.
overall. We're just so trained to take everybody else's feelings into consideration and
Yeah.
not our own, and also not to draw boundaries either. We're
Mhm.
not encouraged to draw boundaries and have like the same amount of autonomy that males are, in my opinion. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
44. That was been my experience. Maybe it's gotten better. I doubt it, seeing how many girls are transitioning, but okay.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because that was what the conversation with the therapist was about, was boundaries. I was
Mm,
saying I'm writing these things, I'm publishing them. I wanted to write about my own experience of identifying as non-binary and then coming out of that identity and coming home to an identity of woman. And I was saying to the therapist, I feel that there's certain topics around which I'm not allowed to have boundaries. So if I were to write that and then a trans or non-binary person came and said, this is transphobic, I felt that I'm not allowed to have my own boundaries and say, this is what I believe. I have a right to say this. And she basically said, yeah, in that case, you're not allowed to have boundaries. Look at J.K. Rowling. She should have been accountable to her audience. And so, yeah, that was like a breaking point for me where I was like, this does not make sense. I can't get,
No, that's so crazy.
yeah,
It's so gaslighty too, man. It make you
yeah,
come out of it feeling a little nuts for a while.
yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
I know, I've been there. Um, I'm gonna assume that you were not into uh, you didn't hold the belief that, women deserved our own spaces at the time when you were in the genderqueer sauce, right?
Yeah. Honestly, it did not come up. Like, I
No, it just
can't
didn't.
remember, yeah, I can't remember that concept even coming up. Um, I do remember, and I've written about this as well, people talking about women and femmes, women and femmes. This
Oh
is for
god,
this space is for women
yes.
and femmes. And I remember even when I was deep in the gender stuff, that never made sense to me. Like always wanting to ask what does femme mean and asking it and getting no coherent
None.
response. But there really was not, at least that I was aware of, like a discussion around single sex female spaces.
That's kinda sad in a way,
It is sad. Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
The first time I heard "femme" being used to just basically what I think is describe a feminine presenting human,
Yeah.
a stereotypical feminine presenting person, it can be a guy or a woman,
Yeah.
which is obnoxious.
Yeah.
It was on a wood carving Instagram. Isn't
Yeah.
that the strangest place to run across this crap? So
Mhm.
I was following this young woman who carves, um, like gnomes and stuff. And she to me looks like a lesbian. So I followed her. She calls herself queer. I'm like, well, whatever. And she put up little she had carved little gnomes that were like more masculine looking and more feminine looking, but both female looking to me. And she said, "Oh, I did a femme one and a mask one or something like that." And then I asked the question of what well, I was like, "Oh, that's so cool to do like, butch femme." Like that's what I thought it was doing. And she was like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Well, what are you talking about?" And,
Right.
and then she was like, and this is the first time I've run across it, right? So femme to me meant butch femme. That's what
Right.
it meant. Um,
Yeah.
but she said, "No, like femme people." And I'm like, "Oh, so not okay. Okay, I think I know where you're coming from." So then, yeah, it ended up that she blocked me eventually. So I asked too many
Asking too many
questions.
questions. Yep. Yeah.
It's such a shame though. I mean, she was deep in the queer non-binary sauce. Had a girlfriend, looked very, looked lesbian to me. So
Yeah.
so let's talk about your article.
Mhm.
I enjoyed it. And tell me about your experience going to Women's Land this last summer. Was this,
Yes.
first of all, was this your first experience?
No, this was my second experience.
Okay.
So I used to live out in Portland, Oregon, and that's where I was when I started writing on my Substack. And so there was a woman I had met online. She had found my work and she called me up and she told me basically like the whole history of women's lands. And there's a wonderful women's land outside of Portland, Oregon that I had been to once. My girlfriend and I went. It was actually right as we were planning to move. We live on the East Coast now. Um, so we went out there. It was a smaller gathering, maybe 25, 30 women, all different ages. And I met a lot of great women out there and just had like a really nice time. We camped on the land there. It's just really beautiful. But so then I kind of stayed in touch in the women's land like network. And then it took, I moved and I'm focusing on my career, my education, all this stuff. So I think about at least a year went by, maybe even like a year and a half. Now we were invited to this Midwest Women's Land, and this was a much bigger festival. I think there were about 750 women there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So we drove out there, my girlfriend and I, and we camped in the woods out there.
You drove?
Yeah, we drove. It was about 12 hours. We did it in 2
So
days.
you're on the East Coast, right?
Mhm.
And you drove like, oh, it's only 12 hours. Do it's a really long, it's very long for me. I looked it up the other day,
Yeah.
how long it would be to drive. I was like, oh damn, it's like 36 hours.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I knew like a lot of the Oregon girls did come out, and some of them flew and some of them drove and some picked each other up along the way. People do travel, but it's much farther from.
Yeah, you know what? I should ask around and see if I can throw in with some women next year, maybe,
I'm
because I
sure you.
really do want to get out there.
Yeah.
But I've never flown and I'm not keen
Mhm.
on it necessarily. So
Yeah.
I don't know. But sorry, continue.
No, yeah. So we went out there. It's a 5-day festival.
Mhm.
There's music every night, all female artists. Women bring their children. There's kids playing, and there's like little like places for the kids to like hang out during the day. There's workshops, like kind of intellectual discussions, and then also like boomerang throwing, yoga. Like they did a whole it's called Amazon Survivor. They do like survivor games.
Oh,
So
that's
there's
cool.
like, yeah, there's just like something for everyone. I really enjoyed it. I had a great time. I met a lot of really cool women. I met a lot of like older women and also younger women. They're the older women who have been there, a lot of them had been coming for, it's sort of like a rebirth of a festival that was going on for 35 years. So a
Mm.
lot of the older women I met had been going to this land for 35 years. And so they had some great stories about like what it was like in the 70s and 80s. And then a lot of the younger women, I had some great discussions about, similar things like most, if not all of them, were at some point in the queer trans world. A lot of detrans women were there. Um
That
and
makes me happy to hear.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, they had specific workshops about like healing the inner feminine, like kind of things like that. It's right, it's basically, and there were even women there who like were not, who had transitioned and hadn't really physically detransitioned, but you just know that everyone who's there is female. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it's a really like beautiful space. There's like open air showers in the sun, and like everyone's showering together. And there was like a butch parade, femme parade, like
Oh,
there,
that's cool.
yeah. Just like, honestly, it felt like lesbian summer camp. Everyone's so friendly. Like it's a small enough festival that you meet people and you recognize them throughout the week, and everyone was just like really kind and friendly, and all the older women were so happy to see younger women coming, because I think one of the
Yeah.
concerns is that everyone's kind of aging out and the next generation is not fully coming to support these gatherings. So a lot of women were saying, we're so happy that you're here and to keep this going. Yeah, it was also a lot of sort of goddess spirituality, like earth-based spirituality. We did some like singing circles and like goddess chants and songs that my girlfriend and I still sing at home. Um, yeah, okay, I'll stop
Was that a
rambling.
first for you? The goddess
Um,
worshiping stuff?
No, not for me. I have been interested in that stuff for a long time. Uh, I'm like a very spiritual person, but not a religious person.
Yeah.
And so I've always been interested in like female-based and female-led spirituality, which often lends itself to that sort of goddess earth worship stuff. And we did some of that at the Oregon Women's Land as well. Um,
Yeah.
But it was kind of new for my girlfriend. She's a lot more of like a kind of practical person. She's not as like woo woo as me, but she really loved it. She loved the singing circle.
That's
And
cool.
she was there every morning. Yeah.
You know what's funny is okay, so I'm gonna assume your girlfriend's Butch,
Yeah,
the
she
same
is.
one you were talking about earlier.
Yes.
Okay. So what's funny is well, I'm Butch and my wife is Femme. Now I'm the one who's into more woo-woo stuff,
Oh, yeah.
and my wife is super practical. So
That's funny.
it's kind of interesting. She also I like to it's funny, I also tend to like what the girl movies, quote unquote, and my wife likes the total bang bang shoot 'em up bro movies, and it's just like it's so funny, like just
Yeah.
that contradiction. But
It's a balance. Like that's one of the things I love about butch femme relationships is that balance.
yeah. um that's cool that she enjoyed herself though.
Yeah.
I that kind of speaks, I think that speaks volumes, that someone who's like, she's not into all this stuff. You don't have to be super into all this stuff to find something there that you can
Yeah.
enjoy.
Yeah.
I've only been to one like women's only gathering. It was a lesbian only gathering, and I think we had about 80 women. And you know what? It was a couple days, and I have to say that alone really changed my perspective a lot on this. And it was such a awesome experience. One of the things I didn't realize was that when I was in that space, after a couple days, like basically towards the end, like the last day, I realized that I hadn't been thinking about my body
Mm,
in like, um, is it too fat? Is it too this? Is it too that? I hadn't really thought about that. I just didn't think about it because all the women there were all different sizes, wore whatever they wanted. And there wasn't this feeling that we were being judged or judging ourselves or judging each other.
or being
Um,
watched the way you feel as a woman out in the world. Yeah.
yes, exactly. You're not being watched in that same way, too. That's a really good point. Yeah, they also had like a yoga thing. There was a young woman who led yoga classes. And so, yeah, it was a really great experience. It made me definitely want more of those
Mhm.
experiences.
Yeah.
There is something I've always felt this way, even when I was a little kid. I always loved just being around women and just female energy. That's it. The minute, and this is my experience, and I've heard a lot of women say this though. You can have a group of women in a room, and a man comes in, and it just changes the whole fucking energy.
Mhm.
It just shifts, and it just does. And women only spaces and female only spaces, I think, are really important
Yeah.
to us, and something that lately I've really been wanting. Well, I fight for it in my own way, but I want to do more to like keep these spaces open and keep these spaces available. And listeners might notice that we're being very vague when we're talking about these spaces and places, and the reason we are is because these places are quote unquote transphobic because they don't allow men in. And the women are scared to be harassed, or these places infiltrated. Michigan Women's Festival had some issues around the whole letting men in, not letting men in situation.
Mhm.
and
That's
and
that's what shut them down. And
I mean, that was a part of it,
yeah.
according to Lisa Vogel herself. It wasn't the whole story, but it definitely didn't help.
Yeah.
um and I just think it's sad. It's sad that we can't say, look, this is a place for women.
Mhm.
Just this place, the whole world, everybody, the whole, it's like, I look at this, men have the whole freaking world, yet we set up one goddamn festival in the
Mhm.
middle of a country, in the middle of the country in the Midwest, and God forbid women decide to gather there. Oh, God forbid that we don't let a man in,
Yeah.
right? And it's just the thing that frustrates me too is so many lesbians and women fall over themselves to throw other women under the bus to let men in because
Yeah.
these men have women feelings, quote unquote.
What's coming to my mind is I I have been very open of the idea of women's spaces for like years now. But going to this festival and hearing especially these older women talk about their experiences around the gender stuff like really did something for me, because when I was in the queer world, like this idea of like a TERF, a trans exclusionary radical feminist, was like this was considered such an evil person. And like for a long time, even when I started writing, I was so scared to be called a TERF. I was so like I look back at my old writing and I'm like stumbling over myself trying to like anticipate the "you're a TERF" argument and be like, no, I'm not a terrible person, you know? And
I
going
noticed that, by the way.
yeah,
I've
I look
noticed an
back.
evolution.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying now to just say what I think and not, you know, argue with myself in my own writing. But that was such a concern of mine. And this idea of like TERFs are evil, TERFs are on the same level as Nazis. Like when I was at this festival, I realized like these are the TERFs, and they're just older women, lesbians who came up in the 70s and like faced so much sexism and homophobia, and who really value female togetherness, who have a clear understanding of woman as female regardless of gender presentation. And these women literally, they don't want to hurt trans people. They don't want to kill anybody. They're not trying to do anything bad. They literally just want to camp with their female friends and lovers in the woods. And
Yeah,
like that realization for me, I was like, these are the women who I, as a young lesbian in my teens and early 20s, was convinced were my enemies, was
right.
convinced were like evil. And so I really like, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is this idea of, people say like queer elders, um, but really what it is lesbian elders, and the lesbian elders are still here, but they're just thinking about things, thinking about gender. They have ideas and opinions that are like so considered so taboo by the queer community that they are excommunicated. And so I've just been thinking a lot about this gap between younger lesbians and older lesbians. Like what the gap is often this conversation about who is a woman, how do we gather, who can come to these gatherings, and the idea of like, yeah, having something that's just for us, that's just for women and for lesbians, is not harming anybody else. And I think that's where a lot of younger women, and probably people who don't even identify as women but are female, like that's what is preventing them from finding their elders, from finding this community. Like that's what's really sad
Yeah.
to me is,
Well, the fact they say queer elders
yeah.
is horrifying because the vast majority of us that's considered queer elders, because I think I'm on the cusp of being an elder at this point. Um,
Mm.
well, if you're like 18, I'm definitely an elder. Like we would not like, I'm not saying queer was never used. It was used by some, but the vast majority of us never used queer. Queer is a slur to us. We don't like it. And like when I was 21 and came out, some people used queer, very little though. And I would have never called another gay or lesbian queer unless I knew that's what they called themselves. Or sometimes if we were friends and we were joking.
Yeah,
And the reason we use it as a joking is the same way we would use like some other kind of slur as a joke to take the steam out of it, because that was a slur that people threw at us.
right.
Right. Like my wife has a story of, walking down the street with her gay friend going to the club and having a car full of guys drive by and scream queer at them and chuck like full bottles of beer at them.
Yeah,
Like, don't, that's erasing history. That's erasing so much history to just act like that word is okay now.
it really does bother me, the idea that that word is now an umbrella term.
And oh
um
my God, you know what I thought the other day?
yeah,
They are now letting straight people call us queer.
yeah,
They've got the
and
rubber
themselves.
stamp.
Yeah. This is like a random story, but I recently met a girl just through like community stuff, and I was like, okay, we could be friends. We started talking and she said, I'm really trying to explore my queer identity. And I said, "Oh, okay, great. So are you interested in dating women?" She said, I don't know." I was like, "Girl, what are you exploring?" Like what? And now she's dating a man. So it's like, okay, cool, fine. And he also identifies as queer. And so now they're in this queer, I'm doing air quotes,
Yeah.
relationship that
Uh,
is a heterosexual relationship. It just like drives me insane
how is that queer though? Like what's queer about that?
because he identifies as non-binary. He uses
Oh,
they,
okay.
them pronouns, and
Oh,
she,
okay.
I guess, is exploring her queerness. I don't know what that means.
You know
Um,
what's hilarious too is honestly queer has come right back around to just meaning its original meaning.
yeah,
It's just weird people.
yeah,
And it's exactly what it means now. Fucking weird
like
people.
he dressed kind of weird, I guess.
Yeah.
Like I'm out of it. Like I've taken myself. I don't want to be called queer. I don't see myself as queer. I'm perfectly happy with lesbian or gay, like because I think it describes an actual experience that I'm having
Yeah.
in a relationship with a woman. Yeah,
Yeah. And I'm if you're homosexual and you want to call yourself queer, knock yourself out.
sure.
Honestly, because I think all should be able to call ourselves what we want, but
Yeah,
don't use it as a blanket term. Don't erase other people's identities, right? Because lesbian, gay, that those mean things.
yeah, absolutely.
The other thing when I'm talking about the terrible turfs,
Mm.
I always, I mean, not that it freaking matters because it doesn't matter what you say or how nice you say it or how logical you say it, you'll just be called a bigot regardless,
Yeah.
or a turf regardless. But it's always worth pointing out that these women only places and festivals, for the most part, far as I know, fully accept trans identified women to come in, like trans identified females, like women
Yes.
who are identifying as men,
Yeah.
even if they took testosterone, whatever. As long as you're female, you can come in. So no, they're not excluding trans people. They're excluding men. They're excluding males.
Yes.
And that's just one of those things where it's like, if you want to have a conversation, let's have the conversation. It's okay to be exclusive.
Yeah.
Sexuality is exclusive. Women
Yes.
in men's spaces should and can be exclusive.
Yeah. Not everything is for
No,
everyone.
that just doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
He lost the whole thread. Like, I'm a liberal. They lost the whole thread with understanding class difference, understanding minority difference, and understanding that every minority needs to make their own space, and that should be respected because they have different needs and different requirements than other people. And like
Right.
that doesn't mean we can't all get together in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
But it's okay for people to have their own space too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really is. I don't know. It's really nuts because when you have conversations like this with like-minded people, it seems so obvious.
Yeah.
And then you try to talk about it with somebody who has, who is of the opinion that female-only spaces are discriminatory and harmful, and it's like you can't even get to some sort of shared understanding. I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but like I'm really interested as a writer, I'm interested in the effect that language is having on our ability to like reach each other and to have
Absolutely.
conversations. Even if we disagree, can we at least be using the same terms in the same way to state our different disagreements? Like that's, yeah.
When I anytime I've had, and I don't have many of them, but anytime I've had a conversation with someone who is ideologically very different, like let's say that the trans identified folks versus me,
Mhm.
um, I will first ask, what do you mean by that? Let's set our terms.
Right.
Because you have to, because we could have a 3 hour long argument and never be talking about the same thing.
Yep. Yeah. And
Right.
interpreting each other's statements and
Yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
So, and you would, I mean, well, you would believe, we can't even get past that. We can't
Yeah.
even agree on the terms. Like you can't
Because
even,
because there's this new concept, which is that we don't have to define terms. So like even on a basic level of like so I understand woman as an adult human female. What do you understand woman as? And it's difficult because a lot of people don't have even that basic definition. They'll say anyone who identifies as a woman, anyone who feels like a woman, anyone who says they're a woman. And like the writer in me gets so crazy because I'm like, you can't define a word using the word itself.
yeah.
That's not a definition. That's not like, can we at least define the word?
Have you
It's
had any, you've probably had more conversations with the queers than I have. Have you had any conversations where you're like, can we agree that there's female and male?
Um,
Because I feel like a lot of times they won't even agree to that.
yeah, honestly, it's a hard one to get at because they'll say, "What about intersex people? Sex is on a
Oh
spectrum."
God, I know.
And then people wanna bring in this, like, this race component, which is that, like, they wanna say that female and male are, like, white European constructs, and that to even attempt to define language around binary sex is, like, a white supremacist, like, idea.
It's
I
so,
came up with that. I
which
came
is
up
so
with that.
racist.
It's like it's not so crazy insane to me. I don't mean to I don't know. But like it's wild to me because I know a lot of people who are not white who sex is a lot of women who are not white who sex is a very important aspect of their lives because of various like policies in their home countries and like very real material ways that being female has affected them. Um, it's just I don't know.
It's strange how the Middle East knows who to put a burqa on.
Mhm. I mean, I'll give this example.
They
My
know they know who to, you know, give genital mutilations to in
right,
different parts of the world, you know.
yeah. I'll use this is like a very tangible example. My girlfriend was born in China under the one child policy. And she was given up because she was female, because there's a very clear patriarchal understanding in China that the male child is much more valuable. And so people would keep the male child and give up the female child. And so she was adopted by an American couple and she now lives in the US and her entire life is determined, well, maybe not her entire life, but a huge portion of her life where she is now is determined by the fact that she was born and somebody looked at her and said, "This is a female infant." And
Absolutely.
that determined, and there was a government policy in place, and there were, you know, centuries old patriarchal norms in China that led to her life going the way that it went. So it's just like so crazy to me that you would say that like female is only a white under it's just like, I don't know. I
It's
can't
absolutely, and it's so racist because you mean to
yeah,
tell me that these folks couldn't understand how babies were made or the difference between male and female
yeah.
until a white person showed up and told them? Like what?
It's so stupid. Like, so right, there's certain arguments that I just don't know what to do. Or
Yeah.
uh, this came up at the women's land, and this woman was arguing that to even attempt to define words, to even claim that like language is made up of words that have definitions is like a white idea.
My
And
God.
she was quoting Audre Lorde, "The master's tools won't dismantle the master's house." And in her mind, the master's tools were words.
We're words. We're
Yeah,
language.
which is nuts to me because Audre Lorde was a writer who
Yeah.
obviously built her entire like public image off of her words, right? But yeah, it's like I don't even know what to do with that argument. So all I was able to say is I disagree. I think there are lots of cultures all over the world that use language to define and understand things. Um, but that's really all I can say with that. And
You this kind of makes me think of another thing I wanted to talk with you about. I don't know if you said it somewhere in one of your social medias or you wrote about it. I can't remember now, but you were talking about that on the Women's Land. There actually was a discussion or a workshop about the topic of whether to let men in or not, or something like that. Wasn't that
so this is the discussion that I'm referencing. The
okay?
workshop was not actually about whether or not to let men in. It was a workshop called Younger Women Speak, Older Women Listen.
Oh
Um,
God.
and so it was an attempt at a dialogue between the different generations.
Okay.
Um, and that was a sticking point that had come up in the dialogue was this conversation around are these older women transphobic? What happened with the gender stuff? And there were at that point there were a couple of like literally two younger women trying to argue that they wouldn't mind if there were males in that space.
Was there other conversations that were had outside of this about in this workshop? I'm assuming there was other conversations that weren't gender related.
Um, oh, like other topics that came up
Yeah.
in yeah, so I came a little late to it, so I think I missed the beginning part, but basically the older women were asking us like they wanted to understand how younger women are thinking. It was
Okay.
a lot around gender.
That
Um,
was okay.
yeah. So they because they wanted to understand why it was difficult to get younger women into this space. And I think the gender question is the barrier.
It
Um,
is. It is.
yeah. And so that was kind of, I don't know if it was meant to be, but that was kind of the main conversation that was being.
Okay. Okay.
And myself and some of the other more gender critical younger women, because there were quite a few gender critical younger women there. Um, we were like, one thing that we were trying to express to the older women was like how much fear there is around speaking your mind on this issue as a younger woman, and trying to like not be completely ostracized from like gay, LGBT, queer spaces. And that was something that I think the older women like hadn't fully understood, because for them it's like this very simple thing of like, we know what a woman is, like what do you mean?
Yeah.
You know, but people are so mixed up in that queer soup nowadays that it's the idea that if you even ask the wrong questions, or even use the wrong, I'm doing air quotes around wrong language, that like it's so easy to be written off as this terrible turf.
And depending what groups you're running in, like you said, if you are a gay or a lesbian, if you are a lesbian or a bi woman, and you are trying to find community and women to date, good luck. It's almost impossible if you're just in the mainstream LGBTQ plus community. Um, yeah, it's really rough. I'm so glad I'm not young in this situation. To be honest, it's
uh,
just like crazy. And I feel for the young women because, I've talked to a few that I think started out pretty gender critical when they detransitioned, and then kind of went back into it because they wanted to date women and they couldn't find
right.
any that weren't identified as non-binary or some other kind of ridiculousness.
And honestly, it's um like, so I'm in school right now, I'm in graduate school, and I have to be really careful about what I say. I like, when it comes to women's land, I had this wonderful experience. I'm not going to ever share that publicly in school, even if we're having discussions about LGBT health and community, where I
Yep.
think that this would be a very important conversation to have. I'm not going to admit that I went to a female only gathering. My girlfriend works in a very queer workplace. It's just a restaurant, but it's run by people who are in this ideology, who are actually lesbians but don't identify as such. And she couldn't tell them where she was going. She said, we're just going camping. But like, there are very real ways as younger women that my education, her work, her livelihood are tied up in being on the right side of these ideas. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, and that's what makes it pretty scary.
And the other thing that I think the older women don't get is that what makes this even more complicated is that you have so many lesbians who are in it and who are enforcing these rules, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That's the problem. Like I'm not going to say any time was easier than another because I think it all just, it all comes out even in the end, I think.
Yeah.
But, if you think back to the 70s when these women were coming up and everything, yes, it was really hard. Like, but for the most part, if you were a lesbian and you were a woman and you came together with other lesbians, you guys were agreeing for the
Right.
most that you were women and that you were lesbians. No,
Yeah.
there wasn't an ideological like this much of an ideological break,
Yeah.
and that's the problem. Like, I can't, and I feel you, right? Like, if I was to go into a just run of the mill lesbian space in my town, which by the way, I don't, there is no lesbian space I can see advertised anywhere in any of the gay anything. But
Yeah.
if I was to go to one of the queer places
Mhm.
and talk about lesbian women only spaces or try to set a women only space up, other
Mhm.
lesbians are probably going to be the first ones to jump all over me. I
Yeah.
would almost guarantee it.
That
So
is, it's
that's the
really,
problem.
yeah, it really is sad. Yeah. Like this workplace that my girlfriend's at, her bosses are a married female couple, lesbian couple, butch femme actually, but the butch does not identify as a woman, uses they them, and it's like it's so sad because it's the first time she's ever had a lesbian boss, and yet it's like a workplace where you can't talk about being a lesbian or being same-sex attracted or being she's the only woman there, the only butch woman there who identifies as a woman and uses she her pronouns.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mhm.
I want, and I know people's livelihood is tied up in a lot of this. You can't speak your mind, but I wonder how long would it take if we all did start to speak our mind and just go, you know what? Uh, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I'm
Why
sorry.
can't
I'm sorry, Max, or whatever the heck your name is. Look, like I know the struggle's real, but come on, like
right.
seriously,
Like, can we
that's
just talk about, like, why I know, I think about this all the time, like, if you were to ask someone, like, "Why are you not a woman?"
yeah. What do you
Why?
mean? Why?
Me. The same questions you asked me at the beginning, you know? Like, let's lay this out. But I don't know, the problem is that people are so reactive that to even be asked it, I think would shut down the conversation.
Yeah, it probably would.
Yeah.
And that's why you would have to lock them in a room and then talk to them. No, I'm just joking. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Sometimes I just want to, though. I'm like, look, just stop for a minute and listen.
No.
Um, it's
Yeah.
just frustrating. It's very frustrating. But I think that I feel like this will eventually burn itself out. I mean, I've always kind of thought that. I don't it's not sustainable because it's not reality.
Yeah.
Reality always comes back around because you cannot deny it for, a long time, really.
Yeah.
You know, you your sex does inform your life experience. It really does. Just how you talked about your girlfriend having basically her whole life would have been different had she been born with a penis.
Yeah,
Like full
100%.
stop.
Mhm.
I mean, I was born in the United States and my life would have been very different had I been born male.
Mhm.
Very different. So
Yeah.
like you cannot say that those things don't matter.
And yet, I don't know. I hope that it'll burn itself out too. This
Some
is the
women disagree with me, and I always wonder if you disagree. I'd like to know why you disagree.
right. This is the one thing that concerns me about this idea of, like, its reality is, how much the internet plays into it, because the internet is like a space outside of reality that people can go to have entire conversations, and they can build up a whole like online self that is detached from their bodies. People have whole like relationships over the internet, and so that's where I feel like people are finding a way to live completely out of reality, and they're finding people who will validate their non-realistic ideas about things. But yeah, I don't know.
Which makes sense because ultimately, trans ideology is a separation from your body. It's a
Yeah,
separation from your reality.
yeah.
And so, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I don't think we were ready for the internet. Humans weren't ready for it.
Yeah, it's really doing a number on people's.
And not just with this, but with all kinds of stuff. Like
Yeah,
it's just, I mean, wow.
yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about your experience in women's land, about your history in the gender soup and coming out of it. It's been really great. You gonna keep writing?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, I'm in school, so my writing is not as, it's not coming out as often as it used to, but I have a piece in the works now, and, being in school, there's a lot of interesting questions that come up around, especially, like, psychology and psychological care, therapy and all that stuff, so for sure.
It might be interesting to have you come back on and talk about that aspect
Yeah,
as
totally.
as a lesbian who's in this right now. It would be great to have your perspective on this.
Yeah, I would be up for that for sure.
All right. Well, thank you, and until next time.
Alright, thanks so much, Carol, it was great talking to you.
Same.